Hello.
Good morning.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well.
Good.
We are in good shape compared to millions and billions of people, so I have no right to complain.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, thanks so much for joining us to speak this morning. We've had a great time kind of going through your music and doing some reading and listening, and just kind of getting a sense of where you stand from a composition standpoint. I think that during a lot of this, I'm going to be kind of referencing two main areas online that I was able to find some information about your music. I think the first one, and a good place to kind of start, is you gave a talk at Huddersfield last March, I think March of 2019. And it was based upon, you had recently written your first orchestral piece and you were kind of going through the processes about that. But in that, you also gave an introduction to kind of the way that you approach music, and you gave a little bit of a talk about your style. And in that, you listed kind of four main aspects of your style. You called them your axioms of style. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about those just to get started.
What did I say?
Oof. I think the first one that I had, and I think this is one that's super fascinating to me, is the score as product more so than sound. And it's very clear in looking at your scores, you know, just the detail that's in them, how beautiful they are, how detailed they are, and just the works of art that they are themselves. So when I heard that you were setting out throughout your entire career to make the score as the product more so than the sound, I immediately connected with that, and I immediately saw it. So I was wondering, you know, as a composer of music, someone who focuses more so on the score than the actual sound is a little bit unique. I was wondering if you could talk to us about why that might be.
Sure. I think for me, the issue is that as a composer of essentially exclusively acoustic instrumental music, the score is, you know, in terms of the process of communication between composer and the rest of the world, performer, audience, the score is what I have, right? The score is my tool. The score is, you know, the thing that I can produce that I have control over. And as a result of that, I've tried for a long time to think in terms of making the score as expressive a tool as it could possibly be. I mean, my music is by and large traditionally notated in that it has 5-line staves and pitches and rhythms and things. But within that, I try very, very hard to make sure that every element of the score is an expressive element. Which is why I write everything by hand, because I'm really concerned to a extreme degree, to a fetishistic degree, is something I've been accused of quite a lot. The shape of slurs, for instance, the size of note heads, the spacing of things. Whenever I have a student that brings me a score that has, you know, it's written in finale and everything is still in the default setting, you know, Times New Roman font and all the lines of this, or the length that finale decided they want to be. To me, that is just forfeiting a lot of expressive potential. That's part of it. Part of it is also that my music, by and large, especially the last decade or so, tends to be extraordinarily intricate, very, very heavy on detail and ornamentation, and, you know, very, very specific rhythms and very, very specific techniques. And to me, it's, in one sense, it's an expression of good faith to the performer to say, I've spent a lot of time considering every little dot on this score, every little curve on this score. I'm asking you to do that. I'm asking you to take this seriously as a type of material. And so I'm trying to make sure that the image that I present to you is as theorized, right, and as worked through, practiced, rehearsed, you know, in my own sense, penciled over, then drawn carefully in ink, to do all that as much as I can. But really, for me, it comes back to this point that the score is an expressive object. Right, and that the score contains things that won't be heard. Even a completely default, you know, untheorized basic score contains things that won't be heard, because, you know, you can't tell from performance whether it says andante or andante con moto, whether the tempo is 63 or 66. Right, these are decisions that are made that are then left as a back channel between the composer and the performer, really, for them to interpret, to run with as they will, to read as they will, to think with as they will. And for me, therefore, it's also, my music has a lot more of that. My scores have a lot more of that. A lot of things that aren't hearable as such, a lot of things that are private, a lot of things that are meant to be whispered to the sort of backstage, as it were, as just a way of expanding the expressive domain that the score can cover.
And that's a really kind of beautiful concept. I especially like what you said about, it's almost like the mutual respect between the composer putting everything they have into this work of art that they present to the performer, and then likewise the performer then being inspired to give just as much back. And I think that kind of dialogue is something that's really, really beautiful.
And I think that the score also can speak beyond the material, beyond, you know, the way I write the notes. They can speak mutely in a way. I mean, I'm really, everything about my work is really, really strongly indebted to, or at least I think it reflects my abiding deep interest in medieval music and the medieval practice of score writing. There's a decorative aspect, of course. There's an aspect that is, that is hidden, illuminated, you know, initials in music manuscripts, black versus white coloration, the way cantus firme are notated, are given as, you know, codes, puzzles, whatever. These are things that are inaudible, obviously, but they convey something about what the music is. So I hope that my work, especially, you know, the handwritten work since 2007, 2008 or so, you could, you know, I could take my glasses off and not be able to see what the pitches are, right? And still, just through the image that it conveys, so these sort of long, sort of flowing lines and the open spaces and the density of ink juxtaposed with the wide swaths of empty space, that tells you something about the music behind all the specifics as well.
Yeah, and it's very clear, all of that coming through. So that's really incredible. And also just a lot of the inspiration in general for some of the pieces. I'm thinking your string quartet from 2014, Inscribed in the Center, 1520 Antwerp, that was based on that that sketch. The kind of you could almost call it minimalist for the time kind of sketch with, you know, the blank space and all of that coming through. And the orchestral piece in that talk that was based upon the kind of theoretical mind structures and all of that. So there is that element of visual design architecture kind of present in a lot of your inspiration. Has that always kind of stuck with you?
I've always looked sort of beyond music for things to get my brain going. I mean, inspiration is a difficult word, but the intellectual history of the Renaissance, the medieval era, for me, largely because of these questions of, you know, codes and ciphers and hidden labor and handwork. You know, I'm really into Burge, which is where that string quartet comes from, and this the idea of etching as a physical activity, of lithography as a physical activity, the relationship of physical effort to the delicacy of line that results. All these things are really important to me when I'm casting about for a reason to write a piece, right? You know, beyond the deadline and the commission and all this stuff. A reason for me to want to write a piece that often, I would say almost always, has something to do with something along those lines, the intellectual cultural history of that time, because of its interest in the hidden, in the ciphered, its relationship to text and to divinity and all of these things. So architecture, you know, the orchestra piece, the homilies of Pope Gregory and the meditative practice. I mean, that comes from this book, The Craft of Memory by Francis Yates, which is a wonderful, amazing book. Just it's a treasure chest of for those who share my interest in this sort of thing. Architecture per se, not something I've spent a lot of time with, but in that route of access to it as an intellectual act, as a devotional, meditative act, is absolutely something that I'm interested in.
And a lot of it comes back to your style, which is kind of a hot topic word that, I mean, many of us have kind of spent a lot of time thinking about, and a lot of the kind of educated definitions about what it is, but also kind of on a deeper sense, like what it actually means to us. And I was wondering if I could ask that compared to another kind of hot topic word, what to you is the difference between style and aesthetic in your works?
I mean, I think maybe even in that talk, I think I defined style for my own purposes, and I defined it as sort of the things that one's work takes for granted. I think the things that one takes as a premise, without which nothing is possible. Some styles are more restrictive than others, right? Some allow for more flexibility and variability in the final product than others because the concerns that get the music going, that enable it to get off the ground, are more general. Aesthetic, I don't know, for me, aesthetic strikes me, thinking about this kind of for the first time in this context, as something that comes from without, right? An aesthetic is something that someone applies to you to understand the work. I would, if I had to answer the question again sort of spontaneously here, I'd say style is the framework one has more or less unconsciously maybe set for oneself, you know, to prevent or to get around the insoluble problem of the blank page, right? Without which nothing can be done. Aesthetic then is the category into which people place the result as a way of recreating a style, maybe recreating a model in their own mind of how to understand the work, right? Because the composer has to have a set of premises to begin, and a listener has to have a set of premises to understand, and they don't have to line up necessarily, and they probably usually don't, I would guess. But I think that might be where those two things relate.
I do like that notion of the listener applying something to the work. And in some of the other interviews that we've done with various other composers, we've talked about the importance of listening through pieces that you don't quite understand multiple times, so that you can really kind of understand it on a deeper level, hear something new each time, and then eventually kind of form the aesthetic that you apply to it. So how do you hope that people kind of approach your music in that sense? Do you hope that they get something new out of it each time? Do you hope that what you've laid out in the score is immediately understood, or is it inherently not?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on the specific piece. I mean, a lot of my work, not all of it, I think, but a lot of it since 2012, and I can date it quite specifically, has been very quiet and very spare. And like, you know, the reason for that is I think these things are rarely so explicable, so I might as well explain it. In 2012, I wrote a piece for the vocal group Exaudi based in London, which is one of my some of my closest collaborators in recent years off and on relatively short notice. And they wrote back and said, "We love this piece, it's great, but it's way too hard. We can't do this in October," right? Which is what the initial thing was for. And so I said, you know, all right. And in 2 weeks, I wrote a substitute piece. I wrote another piece for them. And for me, 2 weeks is insane. I'm a very, very slow composer. I write very, very slowly, very, very inefficiently. So I've never done anything in 2 weeks. I can barely, you know, put my shirt on in 2 weeks when it comes to, you know, compositionally speaking. But here I had no choice. Like, you know, if you want this piece on this great program in this great venue, you know, we need it by the end of the month. And they were nice about it. They were friends of mine, fine. But as a result, I wrote a piece that was very spare because I didn't have time to do anything else. And I wrote a piece that was quiet because the original piece was quiet. And this piece that I wrote without thinking about it became, at the time in 2012, one of the favorite things of mine that I've ever written. And so I sat with it, what did I just do here? And the result was a pretty significant stylistic change by and large. I've been writing pieces based on that model ever since, to greater or lesser degree. Anyway, all that's to say, most of my music is very quiet. A lot of music is very spare. And I think the first impression of my work, therefore, in a concert setting is that it's really, really quiet, right? And really, really spare to a sort of, again, to a sort of extreme degree that sort of dominates probably one's first impression of the music, I would assume. And that becomes whatever, but, you know, when I give pre-concert talks, when I do radio things, it's what everyone wants to talk about. I know it's super intricate, it's super quiet. And so I assume, I would think that after, you know, sitting through a 10-minute piece or 15-minute piece, the first impression of my work is this idea that things are barely heard, things don't come across to the hall at all, they're so quiet they don't escape the stage a lot of the time. They're meant for the listener to hear it, the performer to hear it themselves. And at the same time, that there's a sort of delicacy of detail, the sort of intricate ornamentality, the sort of gesture, the sense of gesture and shape that is sort of peeking through this scrim of extreme quiet. I assume that's the first impression everybody gets because it's kind of overwhelming, right? It's sort of the fact that you have to hold your breath and lean in to hear anything. If I were to be uncharitable to myself, I think people might think of it as a mannerism, right? Or as a sort of superficial way to make headlines, or, you know, so to speak. And then upon further acquaintance, I would hope that the underpinning would come through, which for me, I'm still very invested in pitch and melodic gesture and long range harmonic motion, the way that melodic fragments join together. A lot of my work, the sparsity comes a lot of the time through writing an entire surface's worth of rhythms, a surface's worth of melodic material, and then erasing 90% of it, 95% of it. So what you get is a sort of little blips sort of bursting through the fog or through the haze. But I try to arrange it, of course, such that the coherence that's been erased is still there somewhere. And that sort of thing, I think, is what I hope would come through upon further acquaintance. So I think maybe the first impression of this extreme quietness, extreme fragility, extreme sparsity, extreme fragmentation, and then the more you hear it, the more normal it becomes, right? Maybe the more conservative the impulse appears, because it is at the end of the day. I have a very normal sense of melody, gesture, harmony. A lot of diatonic writing is there hovering in the background of my work. And that, I think, might come through more, the more that you sort of get past the initial shock of whatever the opposite of recognition is, shock of unfamiliarity, to hear beneath that to the details of what's going on.
And this concept of the boundaries in your music, it's something that you've spoken about before, and it's actually something I'd like to use to kind of pivot a little bit to the second source of information that I was able to find. And this one was actually a really fun thing to find. It was an interview that you did with Tim Rutherford Johnson 10 years ago, 2010. Yep. And this jumped out to me because we actually spoke with Tim, it feels like months ago, and I think it was months ago, as our first interview for this, kind of as a way to talking about music. So it was interesting to kind of hear his approach and then to go through and see it kind of in action with your works here. So if I could go back to some of those questions and with the 10 years of difference, see if any of those have kind of changed. And one of the things about boundaries that you said is that your works were existing at boundaries in different ways, kind of in like the physical, where it's kind of endurance based, as well as the instrumental, where you enjoy using more historical instruments because of their limitations and their flaws, and then silence, the music existing there. So how has your view on boundaries before changed into the boundaries that you use now? Has time kind of worked its way into the mix, other types of musical elements, or is it still the same principle of kind of pushing where you can?
Well, it's interesting. In 2010, if I think back to the work I was doing in 2010, it feels both sort of very similar and completely irreconcilable to what I'm trying to do now. I mean, those are these pieces I was writing for the Illusion Ensemble, which is when I sort of had a lot of contact at that time with Tim. The instrumental duos, bass clarinet duo for brass and things. And at that time, I was, as you sort of mentioned in passing, really interested and really invested in the idea of sort of physical strain and exhaustion and the idea of material, a sort of normal material. Again, I go back to this like dichotomy, this cannons, echoes, relatively diatonic material, perceptible and comprehensible material being filtered through, among other things, the inability to play it, at length or under the circumstances of, in the brass instrument, constant extreme high register while singing, while inhaling, all this stuff. And now, that's something I just simply stopped doing kind of shortly thereafter, actually. I'm still really interested in bodies and their effect on performance. And I'm still really interested in marginal states and the boundaries that the instrument places on the body, that the body places on the instrument. But the element of athleticism, the element of statism, that is sort of not so latent, but is quite prominent in those older pieces, is gone. I think my work more recently, something in the last decade has changed in my work, and it's become a lot more vulnerable, a lot more sort of fragile. For me, I feel it a lot more personally, I think, in a way. I think that might be an element of becoming more comfortable with my own working methods, with my own materials, a lot of which have not changed in the sort of, I still make my rhythms the exact same way I was doing 10 years ago. For instance, my pitch-based instincts are kind of the same, but I've become a lot freer in the way I think about performance and about the interpersonal elements of performance and the intrapersonal elements of performance. And for me, performance has become less athletic event than an event based on exposure, and an event based on sort of metaphorical nakedness and attempt at something like a more direct communication. And that communication still fails most of the time in my work through this extreme fail to extreme quietness and so on. But there's something much more exposed about it. I think in 2010, I was really interested when I was in graduate school, 2002, 2006 at the University of Buffalo. My overlap with Aaron Cassidy, who I know you also spoke with. I was really interested in, I just learned about Brian Fernyhough in like 2000. Right when I finished my undergrad, I discovered a score of Fernyhough in the library of Schutakar, in a program at undergrad that had no interest in his work. I had never heard of him. I found the score looking for something else. I was like, and then for the next 5 or 6 years, I was like, okay, this is permitted. What can I do? And I was interested in difficulty. I was interested in extremes of physical and mental athleticism. Then I think, as I said, I absorbed that into something a lot more personal. And there's still traces of that in my work, of course. There's still lots of tuplets. They mean something totally different, but they're still there. But I'm interested more, I think, in what performance says about the performer's mental communicative state and less about the state of their oxygen levels, and their lactic acid in a way.
And I think performers may thank you for that.
Yeah, I'm sure they do. There are some, I've always been impressed the last decade, and this is a whole other topic, by performers more or less you guys' age. As I get older and older, there's a constant stream of performers in their mid-20s or whatever, sort of willing to, sacrifice themselves for for my work. And the meaning of that has changed, but there is a steady stream of willing people to do things. I mean, these pieces still get played, but it's my work has gotten a lot easier physically and probably a lot more demanding mentally, I think, over the last decade or so.
And with this kind of new focus on the performer and the more interpersonal kind of experience of it, one of the things that you mentioned at Huddersfield last year was you take great interest in the experience, the full total experience of the performer in the moment performing the music, in a sense that it's not necessarily replicable performance to performance. But back in 2010, you had mentioned that you didn't really have too much experience kind of working with people in the pre-compositional phase if you were writing a piece for them. With this shift, has this changed much? Have you actually become a lot more focused on the performer?
Yeah, I mean, it's still difficult in a way because for reasons of aesthetics, among many other things, most of my work still is played in Europe, so it can be difficult to sort of have the sort of intensive collaboration. I do when I can, and one thing that's changed since 2010 is I've developed sort of very long-standing relationships with a handful of performers. I'm thinking primarily of the clarinetist Carl Rosman, who played and then recorded this bass clarinet duet from just before 2010 as a member of Elision, which he still is. But I've written several pieces for him in the interim. One for this historical Bassett clarinet that he bought or had commissioned to be built for him, but had not been written for since Mozart, so there was no repertoire at all, and we had to learn the instrument together essentially. And I'm writing a piece right now for him actually for C clarinet, and we'll go back and forth. We talk every day basically. We'll go back and forth all the time about these things. But I think also I know more about how instruments work. I've had more feedback in the intervening decade with a lot of different performers, a lot of different contexts, a lot of different instruments, now of course ranging from soloists to full orchestra, how things work, how things go. So no, it's I like to think, I don't have instruments here. I think I'm quite rare as a composer. My studio is not full of instruments. I don't even have a keyboard. So I don't really pick up instruments, but I still like to think a lot about how it feels to play, how it feels to read the notation, how it feels to breathe while you're playing. Even if you're playing percussion, how it feels to be physically in the space of performance. That's still very important. And my work has become more sensitive to that, I think, more than just sort of a brute force aspect, like it might have been more in 2010. I've been writing a lot for piano lately, just through circumstance. The commissions have come in that sort of chunk, a lot of piano and small ensemble or piano solo. And I've been thinking a lot about the microscopic interface of finger to key and the microscopic elements of the mechanism of the keyboard, the second escapement attacks, the compromised attacks, the various percussive sounds, and the world that exists in there without ever going inside the piano, which I have a lot of conceptual problems with, but the sonic vocabulary that exists with the key on the scale of the millimeter. And building an entire, I have a piano piece I finished earlier this year, right as everything went to hell, that builds a vocabulary around this sort of microscopic things that involve how the keyboard feels against the finger. So I didn't get the pianist's feedback on that per se. I did play around with it a little bit, of course, in the reel I had to, but it is really, I'm really thinking a lot about the moment-to-moment sense of what it means to be in a body and be on stage playing my work.
And I think that experience really also plays into the style of your scores and your musical idea overall, of just the detail that goes into it, and putting together this whole cohesive product as one kind of detailed sketch. I'm trying to go back through some of these other questions here. One that was interesting to me was the discussion about musical material and how you kind of turned that question about what is musical material into what is contained within musical material, not just notes and such, but also duration and time. And I was wondering how your thoughts about duration and time as musical material have evolved. And, especially now, one of the things that we've seen with the lockdown is that time is completely askew. People are experiencing it in the most obscure ways, where it's slow and fast at the same time. And, what is this period going to have an influence on in terms of time for you?
I don't know. I mean, this is, as I said at the beginning, I have no right to complain about the effect of lockdown on me, and I won't. But I will say that having a 5-year-old and 3-month-old has made it's hard to be locked down and be a composer at the same time, to think in these terms. But what I will say is that another symptom, as I mentioned before, when thinking back to where I was in 2010, and this is also nice because I just turned 40 last week, so I'm talking as a 40-year-old looking back at my 30-year-old self, my naive, callow youth, right? That still in terms of coming to terms with and learning to understand my own material, I think very, very commonly for composers that is affiliated with a sort of a drive towards rigor and system, right? Because to reduce the impetus of the decisions that the composer has to make freely. So one thing that has changed in the way my pre-compositional work goes since that era, is that it's become a lot less systematic. I used to write out, I think I mentioned in that talk with Tim, or that interview with Tim, I used to really aggressively and really rigorously think of the entire time span of a piece in terms of durational containers, and to account for every second as sort of a durational structure that then got filled, and the durational structure would be taken as an axiom of reality that was essentially immovable, because without that I had no bearings in my own material, right? And as I mentioned, I still use exactly the same system to create durational structures, to create local rhythms, everything from local rhythms up to, you know, several minute long stretches. I wrote a little Python program in 2005 to generate proportional structures, and I still use it to this day to make tables of, you know, rhythmic possibilities, durational possibilities. But what has changed, and really just changed in the past couple of years, that I take as a symptom of my own comfort with my own material, which has good things about it and bad things. It means both fluency and possible habit forming, is I will move things around, I will cut things, I will add things, I will sometimes, and this is something that for me is something that is almost unthinkable. Sometimes I'll just sit down and write music, right? There was a time when did I write this piece? 5 years ago now, I think, a tuba solo, where I just, for the first and last time, literally started with a blank piece of paper, drew the staves, and, you know, with a ruler and pen, and wrote the piece from beginning to end, just without any pre-compositional planning at all. And that was something. I liked the piece. It almost nothing happened, so it was relatively easy to do. But even in bigger pieces now, the orchestra piece, which is, you know, 16 minutes with full orchestra, there was a lot of swapping around of large-scale things. This doesn't work, we need more music here, which is the sort of sentence I would never have said 10 years ago, because if it doesn't work, it's the fault of the music, not the time. So duration used to be the be-all and end-all of my work. It used to be everything. It used to determine everything else. Proportional structures on all levels. Now, because I'm more comfortable with knowing what I want and knowing how to get it, it's still there on the sort of the medium ground level, I'd say, the level of a section, the level of a 3 or 4 minute passage. But I'm thinking a lot more intuitively about rhetoric, about the way pieces go, about long-range recurrences of material, about the way that things happen for too long. For instance, things might be held for too long, silences that are too long, which is something I've been a feature of my work for a long time. But then I can react to those more freely and more sort of, I keep coming back to the word sort of affectively, emotionally, right? Spontaneously, which I don't know if that's perceptible to a listener at all, frankly, it might not be. But that's how I think of these things now. So for me, duration, again, it used to be almost a violent structuring force. It used to be something that things would push up against, that things would be in conflict with. And now if something happens that happens too long, which, so, as I said, still happens quite a lot, things are lingered on in my work, a held pitch, a recurring event, a silence, for a surprisingly long time, a narrow material state. It's because that pressure is coming from within itself. It's not something that's imposed from without. That doesn't have anything to do with quarantine or lockdown. As I said, I think, I mean, again, I have not had the mental space really to think in those terms. I've really just started working again in the past 2 or 3 weeks for the first time since February. But I'll also say, because I know I watched a couple of these things, I know it's something that you guys are interested in, and that's good, that's very good. I've never seen any relationship in myself to my work and the outside world, really in any way, politically, socially, aesthetically. I think we talked about this also maybe came up in Tim's interview, I think, and has not changed. If people want to read it that way, that is great. That's wonderful. That's one reason to make art, is so people can live with it and live alongside it and have it, you know, inflect their lives in whatever way it does. But that way of thinking is completely foreign to me in my own compositional work. So I'm happy to talk about it, but that's something that my brain doesn't do.
Again, letting the listener kind of take
Sure.
from it what they will. Yeah, very nice. I think the last thing that I'll ask about Tim, and this was one of the things that he told us about in his interview was this particular question, and we had a lot of fun with it. The question of, here's middle C, what do you do next? And in 2010, you didn't really go off on too much of a detailed explanation of what you would do. But
Right.
we haven't asked that. Yeah, we haven't asked that question to other people because we didn't want to steal his shtick there. But if I can take it and spin it on a personal level to you, here is a middle C that is held for 20 seconds. What do you do next?
Oh man, again with that question. Well, I will answer the question. I will say that it does happen for me that I get fixated on pitches. I don't know why. I have absolute pitch, so maybe that might be related to it. I can't sing that. I can hear absolute pitch. And so very early, before anything had been decided about a piece, I will think, okay, without even thinking about it, it's obvious to me that this piece starts on, you know, the F sharp at the top of the treble staff. That is incontrovertible. That cannot be changed. Before I think about what instruments play, what instrument's going to do it, what register that is in for the instrument, all that stuff, the the nuts and bolts. It's like this is obvious. I can't help it. So maybe was that, I don't remember if that was true in 2010 or not. Those pitches for me tend to be higher than middle C, or whatever. For that, what that's worth, I guess my music does tend to be high. Now that I think about it, but middle C, middle C held for 20 seconds. I think it depends a lot on the instrument. Is it a sustaining instrument? Is it a string instrument?
Whatever you prefer.
Okay.
No. I'm gonna make it a triangle because I'm a percussionist.
Okay. Is it like sustained? Is it like bowed or something? Or is it just like a triangle attack?
No, just a triangle pitched middle C that you hit and sustain for 20 seconds. Yeah.
I think, well, there is a diagram that I'll draw it for you and try and hold it up. This is my version of Zoom screen sharing. That I have written in my sketchbooks a lot as to sort of concretize my intuition by the way of thinking about music and its rhetoric in time. There, it's a little square with a dot towards one corner and a little arrow going even further into that corner. Is this visible, I guess? Maybe I'll hold this up here.
That is beautiful.
Oh, thank you. And what this means to me, it has a very concrete meaning. It's sort of like a talisman, something I draw sometimes when I'm thinking about what to do. Is that my work often has to do with quietness and sparsity. It starts by being off center already, right? It starts by taking a relatively extreme position of, PP, something, of fragile timbres, of expansion in space, of silence, whatever. And then my intuitive way of developing material like that is to go further, right? I think normal people, the normal compositional instinct would be to start with a bold symbol like that, and then to reconcile it with a sort of more normal means of musical progression, rhetorical progression, right? You start with, say, a C on a triangle in isolation, and then you do it again, and the density gradually builds, right? My instinct would always be, if you're starting with something like that, like a C on a triangle, to let it live in the space, resonate in the space, be in the space. And then instead of using that to gradually build up to a more immersive, more detailed, more eventful soundscape, to say, okay, this is an event that is spare, that is unitary, that is limited in its timbral and harmonic content, and then to proceed in direction of further limitation until the entire thing is zeroed out and emptied out. And then what will often happen is the piece will start again, sort of somewhere else. So a lot of my pieces will take that form of sort of like a series of, essentially, broadly speaking, series of diminuendi, right? Something will happen, it'll gradually disappear into a more extreme version of itself, and then something else will happen and the same process will begin again. That's sort of how my structural progress seems to go sort of intuitively, to the degree that I'm now trying to fight that intuition, because I think it's starting to happen a bit too much. Anyway, so in accordance with that, I think a triangle hit held, let to resonate for 20 seconds would be followed by some sort of extended silence, maybe do another sort of resonant percussion thing, maybe unpitched, of a bell plate or something with soft mallet that you can barely hear that resonates. And then that would lead to a language, let's say, of dry resonant percussion pebbles, some sort of clicking sounds. Most of percussion writing these days takes the form of clicks, clicking sounds that establishes a more ornamental, flexible language, but goes on just way more than the natural resonant properties of the triangle, for instance, would dictate. And it sort of takes over the sense of time by more and more limiting the ambit of the sort of material, going from the thesis of struck event, event with notable attack, and then sucking away almost everything about that event until you're left with nothing but the possibility for a little ornamental cloud of these little clicks drifting off into space. There you go.
Sounds like I'll be able to take that framework you just laid out and put it on my next recital. I think it's right there.
Than I was 10 years ago, I think, if I recall it correctly. I tried to dodge the question then. I try not to dodge it now. So hopefully.
Thank you. And this concept of limitations, of restricting yourself or pushing the music to where it is. I mean, it goes back to the boundaries discussion that we'd had earlier. But I'm thinking forward a little bit in this pandemic world where the future of music is uncertain in terms of being able to play with each other in a safe capacity for audiences. And your music is so specific to the interaction of the musician to the music and what that means. And I'm wondering, you know, if we have to continue doing music in some sort of virtual setting or some sort of just performance event that is not what we're used to. It's very much at the edge of the limits of what most of us can do. How do you see music kind of going forward? Not necessarily your music, but music performance in a world that doesn't really look like it used to.
I am really, really, for myself, committed, by which I mean my image of the whole point of music, honestly. I have a wall full of CDs, but my image of what music is really profoundly based on the idea of sharing space and looking in the eyes of the audience, like the audience looking in the eyes of the performer. This goes back to what I was saying before about the sense of vulnerability in my recent work and the way I'm trying to create a sense of thwarted but still real communication as opposed to sheer athleticism. So I am just uninterested in the extreme in sort of, whatever Zoom-based concert giving. Other people aren't, and that's wonderful, and ensembles do what they want to do and what they need to do. I don't think my work works very well in that context necessarily. I will say that my work, if I'm in charge, if this is about me, right, if the COVID-19 pandemic is about me, the way forward for my work is something that's been done a bunch, actually, I think. It's done a few times. I like the idea of exaggeratedly intimate performance. I've had a couple times where music of mine has been played for one person at a time, for instance, solo work. I've had, no contemporary composer is a stranger to small audiences. But this idea of one-on-one-ness or one-on-five-ness, actually, I think it's an economic disaster that, for the ensemble, of course, potentially. But artistically, I think for me, it works very well. And I know one thing, an ensemble I work with a lot, Music Fabrique in Cologne, they're in Germany, they're more or less doing a lot better than we are here in the US. They've started giving concerts again. And they have these things called concertini where they are giving concerts in shifts. I think they're doing 2 of them a day with, chairs spaced apart and small audiences and things. In a room, they're playing repertoire, and then a couple hours later they're playing it again. And that sort of thing, they're sort of, chamber music in the 18th century sense, right? Music for a small room. I don't love that acoustically. I like resonance and space for the music to breathe. But I think as a social event, it's that is fine by me. I do think that there is, of course, obviously, a lot of potential for using the media that we live with now, for musical ends. I think there are a lot of people of my generation and of your generation who are working that way. And I know these things are already being done. I know there are already Zoom operas. I know there are already, sort of virtual sound installations and virtual sort of experiences in this way. I just, I can't do that. This goes back to where we started in the way that my work is about the score, my work is about the person, my work is about the space. My work is not about sound, it never has been. This is why I don't do and never have done electronic music, because I'm not interested in working with sound as a material. I'm interested in working with performers and notation as material. And the sound is the imperfect means by which that material is communicated. I think, I wouldn't go this far, but there's a sense in which you could say the sound is sort of an ad hoc substitute for giving the audience a score and letting them play it themselves, sort of thing, or live with the act of performing it themselves. So this is, that species of pandemic era art is not something I can do. If you made me do it, I'd try to figure it out, but I'm opting out of that. I'm looking towards 2021 and 2022 and beyond for future projects, I think, at this point. I do think your question about time is an interesting one. Starting again, filtering through my experience of young parenthood, the cliched saying about parenting is that the days are long, but the years are short. And now I feel like the days are long, but the years are long. But at the same time, I think, beyond this, which is my lens in this particular situation, I do think the new way, and I know that Tim actually had a beautiful blog post about this, and he has his own situation there where he was on particular lockdown for a long time as a high-risk individual, that the sense of swimming in time, the sense of time losing directionality and losing its telos, losing its means of articulation through the sense of what it means to accomplish something, right? Does, you know, I think you could say it has to do with my work, especially of the 2010 era, right? The idea that time exists independently of what we're doing with it. This has to do with boredom, right? It has to, you know, the lineage of Cage and, you know, the time, filling the, creating the time span before you fill them and filling them independently of the existence of the time span, which leads to 433 as an extreme example of that approach to writing music. I think there's something to be done with that, I think, and I think you could think about my work that way. It's not something I sat down and said, I'm going to write about this, I'm going to write with this. The work I just started doing in the last couple of weeks is unaffected by it, at least in its conscious approach. But we'll see. I don't think it's, who knows how long this will last, who knows what effect it will wind up having on any of us.
Absolutely. Now is the time for everybody to get a little bit creative with it and really kind of see what happens. So I think the last question I have on my end is, if you've watched a few of ours, then you'll probably know what's coming. But what are you reading these days?
More than you might think, actually. I think it's in lieu of working, in lieu of writing, it's been something I've been trying to get more to. And in fact, I set myself, I remember this, it seems like March seems like 10 years ago, but I set myself sort of a project in March when my son's school was canceled and when it was apparent that this was here now. This was in, you know, Massachusetts, where I am, that I was going to read, and I was going to revisit some things of some favorite books of mine that I hadn't read in a while. I was going to read a lot more fiction, which not something I tend to be more of a reader of intellectual history and philosophy and things, and art history. But the first thing I sat down with was my favorite book of all time, probably, if I had to pick one, which is The Great Fire of London by Jacques Roubaud, who was sort of a Oulipo writer, and he's also a mathematician. But this is a book that I will happily plump for here, because I think people need to read this book. It's about his, it's not about anything. It takes place in the wake, it's non-based autobiographical, essentially. It takes place in the wake of the sudden death of his young wife. And it is a record of him living in the aftermath of that, and working and trying to work and trying to write in the aftermath of that, and writing this sort of ambitious project, which was called, the project he had called The Great Fire of London, that I think had begun before this happened and the wake of after. And the reason I love this book so much and it's so important to me, that it is the single best example that I've ever seen of form as expression, because it's a book that it's repetitive. It has these things you have to flip back and forth. It has insertions at the end. You have to flip page 246 and read this and then jump back. So it's digressive. It is fragmentary. It's very difficult to read. It is large swaths of it are quite boring. It's a lot of it's sort of very, you know, neutral and descriptive, but you get this sense of what it means. Not maybe this might be a model for pandemic literature too, frankly, to live with that sense of dislocation, of disorientation. And it's the record of trying to live and to be a creative person in this state of utter emotional, for him at the time, dislocation, and the form is a dislocated form. That's, like I said, I'm going to start there, and then there's also part of a large project. There are 7 books in this series. I think only a few of them have been translated into English so far, and my French is not up to it, so I've read a couple more. I've also discovered, this will be useful to your listeners, that Virginia Woolf is a very good writer. I've been reading a lot of Virginia Woolf lately for the first time at a project for my 40th year, I guess. Just, so I've been sort of revisiting things that I've been either meaning to read for a long time, like Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, things that I have meant to revisit. Other Oulipo writers, Joyce Perec, W. or The Memory of Childhood, another autobiographical, semi-fictionalized novel with a strange form, and things like that. I think this is a symptom that a lot of the reading I do is meant more or less to feed into my work. So we get a lot of intellectual history, a lot of art history, a lot of these things that I mine for, if not ideas per se, concrete musical ideas, then for frameworks and things that excite my intellectual capacity for making new things in the world, I guess. Then in March, when I knew that was going to happen for a while, I think maybe it was time to sort of look at other forms of reading, other forms of doing that are less instrumentalized, more for the music.
I think now is the time to kind of get back into those original inspirations and really enjoy them while we have the time. Well, Evan, thanks so much for lending us your time and for speaking with us about all sorts of different topics, your music and your inspiration and all of these things. And unless anybody else has any other questions they'd like to go through, I think that's just about it.
This was awesome. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you for having me. It's an impressive list that I'm flattered to be a part of.
Of course, we're very happy to have you on board.
And I love what you guys are doing. I will say again, I think that I'm a composer who works, to the degree I can in my pajamas all day. And the idea of, making an ensemble like this, the organization, the concert producing, the producing thing like this is something that I can't even begin to understand how it actually happens in the world. I'm impressed with you guys. I'm impressed with your optimism, with your, your enthusiasm, your energy. And I'm really, it's a great thing to see the sort of the younger generation of people keeping the torch going. And it's great to be a part of. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
so much, Evan.
We'll talk to you soon, all right?
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode of Everything But the Kitchen Sink. We hope you enjoyed it.
If you'd like to hear more, you can find all the episodes of our summer series on our YouTube channel and our website, alineaensemble.org.
Also, be sure to check out our social media profiles for more information and previews of upcoming episodes. Our handle is Alinéa Ensemble.
Please feel free to share today's episode with anybody you think might like it, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions or comments.
Stay tuned for more episodes of Everything But the Kitchen Sink, released every Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern Time.
And as always, we hope you are all safe and well. See you next time.
I didn't want to depend too much on my first impressions of whether something would fit or not, because I want to find out whether something fits by putting it there. And if it doesn't fit, then the not fitting can be just as interesting as fitting.